The iron gates of Coldwater State Penitentiary clanged shut with a finality that echoed through Henry Walker's bones. As the guard led him down the dimly lit corridor, Henry's slow, deliberate steps contrasted sharply with the hurried, restless movements of the other inmates. The walls, damp and unforgiving, seemed to close in, suffocating any sense of hope. "Look what we have here, boys," a voice jeered from the shadows. Jack Miller, a wiry young man with a cruel smile, stepped forward. His eyes, sharp and calculating, locked onto Henry with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "Hey, Grandpa, what did you do to end up in a place like this? Forget to pay your nursing home bill?" Jack's taunt was met with laughter from the surrounding prisoners, a harsh, mocking chorus that filled the corridor. Henry paused, his eyes meeting Jack's without a hint of fear. "Just passing through, son," he replied quietly, his voice steady and calm. The simplicity of his response only seemed to fuel Jack's ire. "Passing through? You're in here for life, old man. This isn't a stop on your way to the grave." Jack sneered, stepping closer, his breath hot and sour in Henry's face. The guard gave Henry a gentle push forward. "Keep moving," he muttered, clearly eager to avoid any confrontation. Henry continued his slow march, his eyes scanning the faces of the inmates who stared at him with a mixture of amusement and contempt. As he reached his cell, Henry turned to face his tormentors. "I've been through worse," he said softly, his words barely more than a whisper. But there was a weight to them, a quiet strength that momentarily silenced the jeers. For the next few days, the routine of mockery continued. Jack and his gang made it their mission to harass Henry at every opportunity. During mealtimes, Jack would swipe food from Henry's tray, laughing as he did so. "Don't want you choking on this, old man," he'd say, tossing the stolen food to his cronies. Henry's response was always the same: silence. A calm, unyielding silence that seemed to frustrate Jack more than any retort could. Henry would simply find a corner, sit quietly, and read from an old, tattered book he had been allowed to keep. One evening, as Henry was settling onto the thin mattress of his bunk, Jack approached with a group of his followers. "This is my bed now," Jack declared, shoving Henry aside. "You can sleep on the floor with the rats." Henry looked up at Jack, his expression unreadable. "If that's what you want," he said, lowering himself to the cold, hard ground. The other inmates watched, some with pity, others with amusement, as Henry lay down without a word of protest. In the dark, Henry's thoughts drifted back to a different time, a different place, where he had endured far greater hardships. As the days turned into weeks, a few of the inmates began to notice the old man's resilience. Despite the relentless bullying, Henry remained calm, never once losing his temper or showing any sign of breaking. It was a quiet defiance, a strength that lay not in physical power, but in an unshakable spirit. One afternoon, during the brief hour of sunlight in the prison yard, Henry was sitting alone, his book open on his lap. Jack sauntered over, a sneer on his face. "What's so special about that book, old man?" he asked, snatching it away. Henry looked up, his eyes meeting Jack's with a calm intensity. "It's a story about resilience," he said simply. "Something you might learn from." Jack's sneer faltered for a moment, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "Resilience? What's that supposed to mean?" "It means not giving up," Henry replied. "It means finding strength in the darkest of places." Jack scoffed, tossing the book back at Henry. "Whatever, old man. You keep your stories. They won't help you here." As Jack walked away, Henry picked up his book, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The words on the page seemed to glow with a new light. a promise of hope, even in the bleakest of circumstances. And so Henry continued his days in cold water, facing each new challenge with the same calm composure. The clang of the metal doors echoed through the cold halls of Coldwater State Penitentiary as the inmates were led into the dining hall. The air was thick with the smell of overcooked food and unwashed bodies. Survival here was a daily struggle, and the weakest often became prey for the strong. Henry Walker, with his slow, deliberate movements, was a stark contrast to the hurried chaos around him. He moved through the line, his expression calm as he took his tray of food and headed to a solitary corner. The other inmates watched him with a mix of curiosity and contempt. Jack Miller, with his usual gang, sauntered over to Henry's table. "Look at this, boys," Jack said with a smirk. "The old man thinks he can eat in peace." Henry looked up briefly, meeting Jack's gaze with steady eyes. "I'm just trying to have my meal, son." "Meal?" Jack snorted, grabbing the bread from Henry's tray. "You mean my meal? You don't need this, do you, Grandpa?" Henry didn't respond, his eyes following the bread as it disappeared into Jack's mouth. Another inmate, Steve, grabbed Henry's apple, laughing as he took a bite. "Thanks, old man." The other prisoners joined in, taking pieces of Henry's food until there was nothing left. Henry's stomach growled in protest, but he remained silent, his calm demeanor unwavering. He picked up his tray and stood, moving to a different corner to sit. "What's the matter, old man? Cat got your tongue?" Jack taunted, but Henry didn't react. He simply sat with his back against the wall, eyes closed as if meditating. In the dimly lit corners of the prison yard, a few inmates began to notice. "Why doesn't he fight back?" whispered Mike, a young prisoner with a nervous energy. "Maybe he's scared," replied another. "Nah," said Tom, an older inmate who had been watching Henry closely. "It's not fear. It's something else." One afternoon, as Henry sat alone reading his tattered book, Tom approached him. "Hey, old man," he said, sitting down beside Henry. "Why do you let them do that to you?" Henry looked up, his eyes thoughtful. "Sometimes fighting back only feeds the fire," he replied. "I've learned that enduring with grace can be a strength in itself." Tom frowned, not quite understanding. "But doesn't it make you angry?" Henry smiled faintly. "Anger is a poison, son. It eats you from the inside. I've faced worse than this. Much worse." As the days passed, more inmates began to notice Henry's quiet strength. During one meal, when Jack reached for Henry's food, Tom stepped in. "Leave him be, Jack." Jack glared at Tom, his eyes narrowing. "You got a death wish, Tom?" "Maybe," Tom said, "but I'm tired of seeing you bully him." A tense silence fell over the dining hall. Jack's fist clenched, but before he could react, Henry spoke. "It's all right, Tom. Let it go." Tom looked at Henry, seeing the calm resolve in his eyes. Reluctantly, he stepped back, allowing Jack to take the food. But the moment had planted a seed. The other inmates watched, sensing a shift. The nights at Coldwater State Penitentiary were a different kind of torture. The prison, already grim during the day, transformed into a darker, more sinister place under the cover of night. Henry Walker's cell was small, cold, and uninviting. The thin mattress on the metal frame offered little comfort, but it was his sanctuary in this unforgiving place. However, his brief moments of solitude were often shattered by Jack Miller's cruelty. One night, just as Henry was settling down, Jack and his gang barged into his cell. Jack's smirk was as sharp as ever. "Move it, old man," Jack commanded, his voice dripping with contempt. Henry looked up, his eyes tired but calm. "This is my bunk, Jack." "Not tonight it isn't." "I want it," Jack sneered, shoving Henry off the bed. Henry hit the floor hard, the cold concrete sending a jolt of pain through his frail body. The other inmates watched silently, some with pity, others with indifference. Henry didn't fight back. He never did. Instead, he picked himself up and moved to a corner of the cell, curling up on the floor. As the night wore on, the true horror began. The rats, attracted by the scent of human presence, emerged from the shadows. They scurried around the cell, their tiny feet making soft, sinister sounds. Henry felt the first bite on his foot, a sharp, piercing pain that pulled him from the edge of sleep. He suppressed a cry, not wanting to give Jack the satisfaction of hearing his pain. The bites continued throughout the night, each one a reminder of his vulnerability. Henry's thoughts drifted back to his past, to the war, to the camps, to the nights where he had faced far worse. He closed his eyes, drawing strength from those memories, reminding himself that he'd survived before, and he would survive again. Morning finally arrived, bringing a dim light that filtered through the barred windows. Henry rose slowly, his body aching from the cold floor and the rat bites. He washed his wounds as best as he could with the limited resources available, his face a mask of quiet resolve. In the mess hall, Henry's presence didn't go unnoticed. Tom, the older inmate who had spoken to Henry before, watched with a furrowed brow. "Hey, old man," Tom called softly. "You all right?" Henry nodded, his movements deliberate and composed. "I'm fine, Tom. Thank you." Tom shook his head, a mixture of admiration and concern in his eyes. "I don't get how you do it. Every night, every day. How do you keep going?" Henry gave a small, weary smile. "I've learned that life's trials are temporary. What matters is how we endure them." Nearby, Mike, the young, nervous inmate, overheard the conversation. He had seen Henry's suffering and couldn't understand the old man's resilience. "Aren't you scared, Henry? Of everything?" Henry turned to Mike, his gaze steady. "Fear is natural, Mike. It's what we do with that fear that defines us. I choose not to let it control me." Jack, overhearing the exchange, snorted in derision. "You talk a big game, old man, but you're just a coward hiding behind fancy words." Henry didn't react to Jack's taunt. Instead, he returned to his book, finding solace in the pages as he always did. His quiet dignity in the face of relentless torment began to affect the others. Some prisoners started to see Henry as more than just an old man. They saw a symbol of resilience, a quiet defiance that challenged the brutality of prison life. That night, as Henry lay once again on the cold floor, the rats returned. But this time, he was not alone. Tom had given him an old, ragged blanket, and Mike had shared some extra food. Small acts of kindness that made a world of difference. In the darkness, Henry whispered a prayer of gratitude. Despite the agony, despite the cruelty, he found strength in the small mercies that came his way. The prison yard, bathed in the harsh midday sun, was a brief respite from the claustrophobic confines of Coldwater State Penitentiary. Inmates milled about, some engaging in idle chatter, others lost in their own thoughts. Henry Walker sat alone on a weathered bench, his tattered book and a few sheets of paper spread out before him. The pages fluttered gently in the breeze, a stark contrast to the harsh environment. Henry's pen moved slowly, deliberately, as he wrote. The act of putting words on paper was his refuge, a way to maintain a semblance of normalcy and hope. His concentration was so intense that he didn't notice Jack Miller and his gang approaching. Well, if it isn't the old scribe," Jack jeered, his voice cutting through the stillness of the yard. "What's the great Henry Walker writing today? A love letter? His last will and testament?" Henry looked up, his eyes meeting Jack's with the same calm intensity that had become his trademark. "Just some thoughts, Jack. Nothing you'd be interested in." Jack's eyes narrowed, his face twisting into a sneer. "Thoughts, huh? Let's see what kind of thoughts an old man like you has." Without warning, Jack lunged forward, snatching the papers from Henry's grasp. The sheets scattered, carried away by the wind, and Jack's gang laughed, their mocking voices filling the yard. Henry stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving Jack's face. "Give them back, Jack," Henry said quietly, his voice steady but firm. Jack waved the remaining papers tauntingly. "Make me, old man." In a move that surprised everyone, including Jack, Henry's hand shot out and grabbed Jack's wrist with a surprising strength. For a moment, the yard fell silent, the other inmates watching in stunned disbelief. Jack's eyes widened, his sneer faltering as he felt the power in Henry's grip. "What the—" Jack started, but before he could finish, a commanding voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." The voice belonged to a tall, imposing man who had just entered the yard. He was new to the prison, a figure of authority who exuded an air of quiet strength. His name was Officer Grant, and his presence alone seemed to demand respect. Jack tried to pull his wrist free, but Henry held firm for just a second longer before releasing him. The papers fluttered to the ground between them. Jack stumbled back, rubbing his wrist and glaring at Henry. "Get back to your corner, Jack," Officer Grant ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And you," he added, turning to Henry, "are you all right?" Henry nodded, bending down to collect his scattered papers. "I'm fine, officer. Thank you." Officer Grant watched as Henry carefully gathered his writings, his expression unreadable. "You've got some fight in you, Mr. Walker," he said finally, a note of approval in his voice. Henry straightened up, clutching the papers to his chest. "I've been through worse," he replied simply. As Jack and his gang retreated, muttering among themselves, the other inmates exchanged glances. The old man's unexpected show of strength had left an impression. Tom, who had been watching from a distance, approached Henry once the yard had settled down. "Didn't know you had it in you, Henry," Tom said with a half smile. Henry shrugged, a faint smile touching his lips. "Sometimes you have to remind people that you're not as weak as you seem." Tom nodded thoughtfully. Officer Grant's new. Maybe he'll keep Jack in line. "Maybe," Henry agreed, though he knew better than to place too much hope in the system. Still, the presence of Officer Grant and the brief moment of empowerment had shifted something in the prison dynamics. As the day wore on, Henry returned to his writing, his resolve stronger than ever. The confrontation with Jack had been a turning point, not just for Henry, but for the entire prison community. His quiet defiance had shown the others that strength came in many forms, and that even in the darkest places, resilience could spark change. The sun hung low over Coldwater State Penitentiary, casting long shadows across the prison yard. The air was thick with tension, a silence that seemed to press down on the inmates as they milled about, their usual conversations reduced to murmurs. Henry Walker sat on his usual bench, his tattered book open in his lap, but his mind was far from the words on the page. Jack Miller, still nursing his bruised ego from the previous day's confrontation, stood with his gang, their eyes fixed on Henry with a mixture of anger and curiosity. The atmosphere crackled with an unspoken challenge, waiting to erupt. Suddenly, the tension was broken by the arrival of Don Morgan, a tall, imposing figure with a reputation that commanded both fear and respect. Morgan's presence was enough to part the crowd. He walked with a deliberate, powerful stride, his gaze fixed on Henry. "Walker," Morgan's deep voice rumbled through the yard. "We need to talk." Henry looked up, meeting Morgan's gaze without flinching. "All right," he replied, his voice steady. Morgan turned to the rest of the inmates, his eyes sweeping over them with a mixture of authority and disdain. "Listen up, everyone. It's time you all learned a bit about the man you've been mocking." The prisoners exchanged puzzled glances, but none dared to interrupt. Morgan turned back to Henry, nodding slightly. "Show them, Walker." Henry hesitated for a moment before standing up and unbuttoning his shirt. As he pulled it off, a collective gasp echoed through the yard. His back and chest were crisscrossed with scars, some faded with time, others still stark and raw against his skin. "These," Morgan said, pointing to the scars, "are not just marks. They're the story of a man who survived the unimaginable." Jack, unable to contain his curiosity, stepped forward. "What do you mean?" Morgan's eyes narrowed, and he fixed Jack with a hard stare. "I mean, Henry Walker is a hero. He survived the Holocaust, endured unimaginable torture, and saved countless lives, including mine." A stunned silence fell over the yard. Henry remained quiet, his gaze distant as memories washed over him. A young Don Morgan, barely out of his teens, is huddled in a dark, cramped cell. His body is emaciated, his spirit nearly broken. The sounds of war are a constant backdrop. Explosions, screams, the relentless march of soldiers. In the middle of this chaos, a figure appears at the cell door. It's Henry, younger but already bearing the weight of many hardships. He unlocks the cell with a stolen key, urgency in his movements. "Come on, we don't have much time," Henry whispers, pulling Morgan to his feet. Morgan, weak and disoriented, stumbles but follows. "Why are you doing this?" he asks. Henry glances back, his expression determined. "Because we all deserve a chance to live. Now move." They navigate through the chaos, narrowly avoiding patrols and danger at every turn. Henry's knowledge of the camp's layout and his quick thinking save them more than once. Finally, they reach a hidden exit, leading Morgan to freedom. The yard was silent as the inmates processed Morgan's story. Jack's face was a mask of shock, his previous bravado gone. Morgan stepped closer to Henry, his voice softer but no less powerful. "Henry Walker endured more than any of us can imagine. And despite everything, he never lost his humanity. He saved me and many others, risking his life countless times." Henry, his shirt still off, looked around at the gathered prisoners. "I did what I had to do, not for glory, but because it was right." Tom, standing at the edge of the crowd, stepped forward. "We've treated you like dirt, and you never once fought back. Why?" Henry met Tom's eyes, his gaze unwavering. "Because violence begets violence. I've seen enough of it to last a lifetime. What we need here isn't more anger, it's understanding." The respect in the yard was palpable. The mocking jeers that had once followed Henry were replaced with murmurs of admiration. Jack, humbled and silent, stepped back, no longer the center of attention. Morgan placed a hand on Henry's shoulder. "From now on, you'll have the respect you deserve, Walker. Anyone who thinks otherwise will answer to me." The inmates nodded in agreement, the shift in their perception of Henry clear. He was no longer just an old man to be mocked. He was a survivor, a hero, a symbol of resilience. The transformation in Coldwater State Penitentiary was palpable. The same inmates who once jeered at Henry Walker now regarded him with newfound respect. Conversations hushed when he walked by, and eyes that once gleamed with mockery now held admiration. Henry, however, remained the same. He walked the corridors with his usual calm demeanor, his steps deliberate, and his eyes thoughtful. Despite the change in behavior towards him, Henry's humility was unwavering. He accepted the newfound respect with quiet grace, never once letting it inflate his ego. Don Morgan, true to his word, made sure Henry's needs were met. During mealtimes, Henry's tray was no longer a target. Instead, he found himself sitting at a table with Morgan and a few others, the atmosphere around them one of camaraderie and protection. "Here, Henry," Morgan said one day, sliding an extra piece of fruit onto Henry's tray. "You need to keep your strength up." "Thank you, Don," Henry replied, his voice warm with gratitude. "I appreciate it." Jack Miller, meanwhile, struggled with his own emotions. The guilt gnawed at him, the memories of his cruelty a constant torment. He watched from a distance as Henry received better treatment, feeling a pang of remorse with each passing day. One afternoon, as the inmates enjoyed their brief time in the yard, Jack approached Henry. He hesitated for a moment before speaking, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "Henry, can I talk to you?" Henry looked up from his book, nodding. "Of course, Jack. What's on your mind?" Jack sat down, struggling to find the right words. "I've been a real jerk to you. I didn't know about your past. I didn't know who you really were." Henry smiled gently. "It's all right, Jack. We all have our burdens to bear." Jack's eyes flickered with something like hope. "I found something. I think it belongs to you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old, worn photograph. "I found this in the storage room. I think it's your family." Henry took the photo, his breath catching as he recognized the faces. It was a picture of him as a young man, standing beside a friend he hadn't seen in decades. This is from the war," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Jack watched Henry's reaction, a mix of curiosity and guilt in his eyes. "The man in the picture, he looks like my grandfather. Did you know him?" Henry nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the photo. "Yes, I knew him. He was a good man. We fought together, survived together." Jack's face paled as the realization hit him. You saved my grandfather's life, didn't you?" Henry looked up, meeting Jack's gaze with a steady intensity. "I did what I could, just like I did for many others." Jack's voice trembled with emotion. "I've treated you so badly, and you saved my family." Henry reached out, placing a hand on Jack's shoulder. "We all make mistakes, Jack. What matters is that we learn from them." The conversation left Jack reeling, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. He felt a deep sense of shame for his past actions, but also a glimmer of hope for redemption. Over the next few days, Jack's behavior changed. He became quieter, more reflective, and his interactions with Henry took on a tone of genuine respect. The other inmates noticed the change as well. The story of the photograph spread through the prison, adding another layer to Henry's legend. He was no longer just the resilient old man. He was a hero who had touched many lives, even those within the prison walls. One evening, as Henry was preparing for bed, Don Morgan approached him. "You've done something remarkable here, Henry," Morgan said, his voice filled with admiration. "You've changed this place and you've changed us." Henry smiled, his eyes shining with gratitude. "It's not just me, Don. It's everyone. Change comes from within." Morgan nodded, his respect for Henry deepening with each passing day. "You're right, but you've shown us the way." As the lights dimmed and the prison settled into the quiet of the night, Henry lay on his mattress, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. The newfound respect from his fellow inmates was a testament to the power of resilience and the impact of a single, unwavering spirit. In the darkness, Henry whispered a silent prayer, thanking whatever higher power had guided him through his trials. The bonds he had formed, the respect he had earned, would carry him through. And as he drifted off to sleep, the photograph clutched in his hand, Henry felt a deep sense of hope. The days at Coldwater State Penitentiary settled into a new rhythm, one where respect for Henry Walker was a given. The story of his past, coupled with his quiet strength, had transformed the prison's atmosphere. But for Jack Miller, the transformation was personal and profound. Jack couldn't shake the weight of his guilt. Every time he saw Henry, he was reminded of his own actions and the life Henry had led. He knew he had to make things right, but finding the courage to do so was another matter. One afternoon, during the brief recreational period, Jack found Henry sitting under a tree in the yard, his book open, but his eyes lost in thought. Jack approached, his steps hesitant. "Henry," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. Henry looked up, his expression calm and welcoming. "Hello, Jack. Sit down." Jack lowered himself onto the grass, struggling to find the right words. "I've been thinking about everything, about how I treated you. I'm really sorry, Henry. I didn't know who you were, what you've been through." Henry closed his book, his eyes meeting Jack's with a kindness that made Jack's heart ache. "We all make mistakes, Jack. What matters is that we learn from them." Jack's eyes filled with tears. "I've done more than make mistakes. I've hurt people. I've hurt you, and I don't know how to make it right." Henry placed a hand on Jack's shoulder, his touch gentle but firm. "The first step is forgiveness, Jack. Forgiving yourself and seeking forgiveness from others." Jack nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I don't know if I can forgive myself, Henry. Not after everything I've done." Henry sighed, his own eyes growing distant. "We all carry our burdens. I've had my share of regrets too." He paused, the memories of his past flooding back. "I lost my family because I trusted someone I shouldn't have. My own grandson betrayed me. He planted drugs in my home, and I was blamed for it. That's why I'm here." Jack's eyes widened in shock. "Your grandson did that to you?" Henry nodded, his expression one of sorrow but also acceptance. "Yes, it was a hard lesson, but it taught me the importance of resilience and forgiveness. Holding on to anger and regret only hurts us more." Jack swallowed hard, his own past coming to the forefront of his mind. I'm here because of something similar. I got involved with the wrong crowd, did things I'm not proud of. One night, things went too far, and someone got hurt. I was blamed, and I took the fall." Henry squeezed Jack's shoulder reassuringly. "We all have our stories, Jack. The important thing is what we do with them, how we let them shape us." Jack looked at Henry, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and hope. "I want to be better, Henry. I want to make amends." Henry smiled, a warm, encouraging smile. "Then start by forgiving yourself, Jack, and take each day as an opportunity to do better. It's never too late to change." One evening, as the sun set over the prison yard, Jack and Henry sat together, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. Jack turned to Henry, his voice filled with sincerity. "Thank you, Henry, for everything. You've given me hope." Henry nodded, his heart swelling with a sense of purpose. "And you've reminded me of the importance of second chances, Jack. We all deserve them." Their conversations had a ripple effect throughout the prison. Other inmates, inspired by Jack's transformation and Henry's unwavering kindness, began to seek their own paths to redemption. The atmosphere in Coldwater became one of support and understanding, a stark contrast to the hostility that had once defined it. Jack's actions reflected his newfound commitment to change. He helped other inmates, shared his story, and became a symbol of the possibility of redemption. And through it all, Henry stood by him, offering guidance and support. As the days turned into weeks, the bond between Henry and Jack grew stronger. They became not just allies, but friends, their shared journey a testament to the power of forgiveness and the possibility of change. Don Morgan, with his influence and respect among the inmates, took the lead. He gathered a small group in a quiet corner of the yard, including Jack, Tom, and a few others. "We need to do something," Morgan said, his voice low but firm. "Henry doesn't belong here, and it's time we make that known." Jack nodded, his resolve clear. "Whatever it takes, I'm in. We owe him that much." Morgan looked at Henry, who stood slightly apart, observing the scene with a calm demeanor. "Henry, do you have any contacts on the outside? Anyone who can help us?" Henry thought for a moment. "There was a lawyer, an old friend of mine, Michael Thompson. He believed in my innocence, but couldn't do much without new evidence." Morgan nodded. "Then we'll start with him. But we need more than just a lawyer. We need someone with power, someone who can make people listen." The group fell silent, contemplating their next move. It was then that the unexpected happened. During a routine check, a high-ranking official arrived at the prison. As he walked through the yard, his eyes fell on Henry, and a look of recognition crossed his face. "Henry Walker?" the official said, approaching with a mixture of disbelief and respect. Henry looked up, surprised. "Yes, that's me. Do I know you?" The official extended his hand. "Colonel James Anderson, you saved my life during the war. I never thought I'd see you again, and certainly not here." The prisoners exchanged astonished glances. Morgan stepped forward, seizing the moment. "Colonel, we need your help. Henry was falsely imprisoned. He's been here for years for a crime he didn't commit." Colonel Anderson's expression turned serious. "Tell me everything." Over the next hour, Henry and the inmates recounted the story of his betrayal, the false charges, and the efforts to uncover the truth. The colonel listened intently, his respect for Henry evident in his eyes. "We need evidence," Colonel Anderson said finally. "Something concrete that proves Henry's innocence." Jack spoke up, his voice filled with determination. "We have a lead. Henry's grandson, Dario, was the one who set him up. If we can get him to confess, we can clear Henry's name." Colonel Anderson nodded. "I'll use my connections to put pressure on Dario. If he's guilty, he'll crack." The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Colonel Anderson worked tirelessly, using his influence to reopen the investigation into Henry's case. Michael Thompson, the lawyer, was brought back on board, and together they began to gather the necessary evidence. Inside the prison, the inmates did their part. They wrote letters, made phone calls, and gathered testimonies. The support for Henry grew, turning the tide of his once bleak situation. One evening, as the sun set over Coldwater, Colonel Anderson returned with a solemn expression. "We got him," he announced. "Dario confessed. We have his written and recorded statements. Henry, you're going to be a free man." A cheer erupted from the inmates. Henry, overwhelmed with emotion, felt tears in his eyes. He looked at Colonel Anderson, Morgan, Jack, and all the others who had stood by him. "Thank you," he said, his voice choked with gratitude. "Thank you all." The process of securing Henry's release moved quickly after that. The news spread through the prison and beyond, a story of injustice and redemption that captured the public's attention. Henry's calm dignity throughout the ordeal became a symbol of resilience and hope. On the day of his release, the prison yard was filled with inmates who had come to respect and admire Henry. As he walked out, flanked by Colonel Anderson and Michael Thompson, the prisoners applauded, their cheers echoing through the cold, grey walls. Jack approached Henry one last time, his eyes filled with emotion. "You changed my life, Henry. I'll never forget that." Henry smiled, embracing Jack. "You've changed too, Jack. Keep moving forward." The morning of Henry Walker's release dawned clear and bright, a stark contrast to the cold, grey walls of Coldwater State Penitentiary. The news of his exoneration had spread like wildfire, and the entire prison buzzed with an unusual energy. Inmates and guards alike seemed to be caught up in the momentous occasion, recognizing that something extraordinary was about to happen. In the yard, a makeshift stage had been set up. Don Morgan, who had become a de facto leader among the inmates, stood at the center, overseeing the preparations. "All right, everyone," he called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "Let's make sure this goes smoothly. Henry deserves nothing less." Jack, standing nearby, nodded in agreement. "He's done so much for all of us. This is the least we can do." As the inmates gathered, a hush fell over the crowd. The gates to the main building opened, and Henry, flanked by Colonel Anderson and Michael Thompson, stepped into the yard. The sight of him drew a wave of applause, cheers, and even a few tears. Henry, ever composed, smiled warmly at the assembled crowd, his heart full of gratitude. Don Morgan stepped forward, raising his hand for silence. "Henry, today we celebrate not just your freedom, but the impact you've had on all of us. You've shown us strength, resilience, and the power of forgiveness. For that, we thank you." A chorus of agreement followed, and Henry's eyes glistened with unshed tears. He took a deep breath, stepping up to the stage. "Thank you, Morgan. Thank you, everyone. Your support has meant more to me than words can express. I've learned that even in the darkest places, there is light and hope. And you all have been that light for me." The applause was thunderous. As it died down, Colonel Anderson approached Henry, handing him a letter. "This came for you this morning," he said, his voice gentle. "It's from your family." Henry's hands trembled slightly as he took the envelope. The return address was familiar, and his heart raced. He opened it carefully, unfolding the letter inside. "Dear Grandpa, we heard about everything and we are so sorry for what happened. We want to make things right. Please come home. We miss you and love you. With love, your family." Tears spilled down Henry's cheeks as he read the words. The possibility of reconciliation filled him with a profound sense of hope and relief. He looked up, meeting the eyes of those around him. "I have a family to return to," he said, his voice breaking. "They want to make things right." Jack stepped forward, his own eyes misty. "Henry, you've taught us all so much. We wish you nothing but happiness and peace." Henry embraced Jack, then Morgan, and many of the other inmates who had become his friends. "I'll never forget any of you," he said earnestly. "You've been my family when I had none." Michael Thompson, the lawyer who had tirelessly worked to prove Henry's innocence, took the stage next. Henry's case is a testament to the importance of never giving up, of fighting for what's right. Today, justice has been served, and a good man walks free. With those words, the ceremony concluded. Henry, holding the letter from his family close, walked towards the prison gates. The guards opened them slowly, and as he stepped through, he turned back one last time. The inmates and guards stood together, a united front, watching him with expressions of respect and admiration. "Goodbye, Coldwater. Henry murmured, taking in the scene one final time. Thank you for the lessons, the friendships, and the hope. The sunlight was warm on his face as he stepped into his newfound freedom. Colonel Anderson and Michael Thompson flanked him, guiding him to a waiting car. Ready to go home? Anderson asked. Henry nodded, his heart full. Yes, I'm ready. As the car drove away from Coldwater State Penitentiary, Henry felt a sense of peace wash over him. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was filled with possibility and hope. He looked out the window, the landscape passing by in a blur, and whispered a silent prayer of thanks for the journey that had brought him to this moment. In the rearview mirror, the prison faded into the distance, but the memories of the people he'd left behind remained vivid in his mind. The atmosphere in Coldwater State Penitentiary had undergone a remarkable transformation. Henry Walker's influence had left an indelible mark on the prison, inspiring a newfound sense of hope and self-improvement among the inmates. The yard, once filled with tension and hostility, now buzzed with activity as prisoners engaged in educational and rehabilitative activities. Don Morgan, a natural leader among the inmates, had taken it upon himself to continue Henry's legacy. He organized study groups, encouraged participation in vocational training, and fostered an environment of mutual respect. The change was palpable, and the prisoners, motivated by Henry's resilience, embraced this new chapter with enthusiasm. One day, while cleaning out an old storage room, a group of inmates stumbled upon a hidden gem. Behind a stack of dusty boxes, they discovered a small, makeshift library. It was filled with books, novels, history texts, and self-help guides, all meticulously organized. Jack, who had become one of the most ardent supporters of the new initiatives, held up a book, his eyes wide with wonder. Look at this, Morgan. Henry must have smuggled these in over the years. Morgan took the book from Jack, a smile spreading across his face. This is incredible. These books can be a lifeline for so many here. The news of the hidden library spread quickly, and soon inmates flocked to the room, eager to explore the treasures within. The library became a symbol of hope and learning, a testament to Henry's enduring influence. Inmates who had once spent their days in idleness now devoured books, their minds expanding with each page turned. Amidst this transformation, a new prisoner arrived at Coldwater. Dario Walker, Henry's grandson, had been convicted of his crimes and was now facing the consequences of his betrayal. As he was led into the yard, the other inmates recognized him immediately. Whispers and murmurs followed him, their eyes filled with a mix of disdain and curiosity. Don Morgan stepped forward, his expression stern. "So, you're Dario," he said, his voice cold. "You've got a lot to answer for." Dario looked around, his face pale. "I know. I deserve whatever's coming." Morgan nodded. "You're right about that. But you'll also get a chance to redeem yourself, just like the rest of us." The inmates circled around David, their expressions unforgiving. Jack stepped forward, his eyes hard. "Your grandfather saved my life. He saved all of us in one way or another. You'd better prove that you can be half the man he was." Dario nodded, his voice trembling. "I will. I promise." That night, as David lay in his cell, he felt a mix of fear and regret. He knew he had a long road ahead of him, one filled with challenges and scorn. As he stared at the ceiling, lost in thought, he noticed a piece of paper tucked under his mattress. Curious, he unfolded it and began to read. "Dario, I know you've made mistakes and now you're paying the price. But I believe in redemption. I believe in second chances. This place is tough, but it can also be a place of growth and transformation." Don't let the past define you. Make amends, seek forgiveness, and become the man I know you can be. With love, Grandpa. Tears welled up in Dario's eyes as he read the note. As the months passed, the prison continued to evolve. The hidden library flourished, becoming a beacon of hope for all who sought its knowledge. The inmates, inspired by Henry's legacy, embraced the opportunities for self-improvement and mutual respect.